This episode deals with issues concerning suicide and depression. If you require support, please see the links provided in the show notes.
If you'd have asked me all those years ago, or anyone else in our small fundamentalist church, if we were a cult, we'd have indignantly replied, absolutely not. Other groups like the Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses, they're cults, but we're not a cult. Everything became normalized, though, but it wasn't until decades later, after I deconstructed my entire belief system and walked away from the Christian faith entirely, that I began to see just how cultish the whole thing actually was. But before all of that, for over 20 years, I'd served both as a pastor and a Bible college teacher, so I had a hand in it, furthering the toxicity also. So in the process of rebuilding my life and discovering my authentic identity, I've got lots to work through, things like religious trauma syndrome, rapture anxiety, and just so much more. Join me, Dr. Clint Haycock, on the Mind Shift podcast as we take a look at such topics as cult tactics and psychology, religious trauma syndrome and religious addiction, taking your life back after leaving a cult or high-control group, and finally, dominion theology and the dangers posed by the Christian right, not just in America, but indeed the world. You can find my show on iTunes, Podbean, Spotify, or anywhere else you get your podcasts. Who knows, it might just be time for a mind shift.
Welcome to I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist. Today, Troy, we have got someone telling their story. So it's an episode of someone else's story. We know people like stories. They identify with stories. Who today is telling their story with us?
Well, we've got Kit Kennedy, who's joining I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist today. She was a podcaster, a blogger. She runs the Unchurchable podcast, which I know is available on all good podcast platforms. She's a PK, for those of you that don't know what that means. That's a pastor's kid. But here we go. Listen to this. She is a whistleblower, and she also uses a pseudonym. So welcome to I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist, Kit Kennedy.
Yes, Kit Kennedy / Clare McIvor, or Clare Heath-McIvor. I've got so many names, but yes, Kit Kennedy is the one I prefer to use for this. It is lovely to be here. Lovely to finally meet you guys.
And we're really glad to have you on the show. We really are. Kit, I think we often start our conversations with people saying, and we already know the answer to this, but let's just pretend we don't. Were you a teenage fundamentalist?
I was a teenage fundamentalist. I was a homeschooled, flag dancing, street ministering, prophesying. What else did I do? Yeah, I think the flag dancing is probably the most mortifying. I used to wear T-shirts under my spaghetti strap singlets because, you couldn't show skin. I was about as fundamentalist as they could get.
So where did it all start for you? Where were you brought up? What was your family environment? What was your experience? What were some of those things that you were just saying as a teenage fundamentalist that you did?
My childhood was spent in a little country town called Sale, which we thought was the centre of the universe and some special portal for God's plan in Australia in the Southern Hemisphere. And my dad took over a church when I was 8 years old or 9. Really, it was an unremarkable small group of charismatics in the early 90s. At that stage, it was just me and my sister. 3 other siblings would join us later on, but I was homeschooled from grade 1 because mum and dad didn't like the attitude change, they said, when I started school. I think for a lot of teenage fundamentalists, homeschooling is actually a mechanism for parents to exert a little more control over their kids and not surrender that control to school. So I have my questions over why I was actually homeschooled. When I was about, 15 was when things kind of took a bit of an uptick. My dad joined the Isaac Network under the leadership of Dr. Jonathan David over in Malaysia. And that was really, or is really, a kind of hardcore New Apostolic Reformation kind of movement, heavy on the dominionism teachings. We'd sing songs like "Crossing Over to Take Over" and "Let's Go Take This City," and we'd learn about how to exert political influence. That was from, he joined that network when I was 15. I made my first trip over there in my early 20s, but by that stage, a lot of other people had been several times. There was a discipleship class that all the teenagers in our church took part in called Training for Life. It's what you'd call Robert Lifton's thought reform process, really, where you're focusing so hard on the renewing of the mind and so hard on internalizing the doctrine of the apostle. We started to kind of be really bathed in this purity culture experience. And I mean, there's so many themes here that are common across various different churches in America and the West. But I think what made my experience quite interesting was the political focus and the high degree of involvement in the lives of people in church. Like, Dad's still, well, I can't tell you exactly what he does because it's been 7 years since I was shunned, but leadership meetings were something where you'd have to pour out all of your deepest thoughts and deepest shames, and there was this echo chamber of agreement around whatever Dad wanted or whatever Dad thought the Spirit was telling him, and all these cross accountabilities. And while I was there, people were in the habit of asking him whether they could start a relationship, what they could do within the context of that relationship. They'd ask him about jobs or houses or financial decisions, stuff like that, superannuation, all sorts of things.
Kit, was that a seeking of advice or was it a genuine asking for permission?
I'll put it this way. A statement that I heard often in discipleship or stuff like that was, if you listen to the word of the Father, i.e. Dad, all will go well with you. And the other statement that was thrown around a lot was, you learn by obedience or you learn by pain. So, and I mean, who in their right mind would choose pain if you feel that the judgment of God is coming for you if you step out of line? So I think in high demand groups, in high control groups generally, there's a really fine line between genuine seeking of advice and asking for permission because of the level of fear, because of the level of God's going to judge you, because of the level of group interaction with how you live your life. If you sin, then you've sinned not only against God, but people like, I'm upset, you've upset me, you've sinned against me, kind of thing. So I don't know the answer to that question, Troy. I feel like it for the inner circle of leadership, it probably felt a lot more like asking permission. Certainly felt like asking permission for me. But for people in the outer circle of the church, it probably felt more like just seeking advice.
So I just want to contextualise this for people. This is Sale in Victoria in Australia. It's a relatively small town, 10, 15,000 people, probably a fair bit smaller than that when you were growing up. It's a Royal Australian Air Force sort of town connection as well. So this is not an enormous town, but you're talking about that this is the portal of the Southern Hemisphere, essentially, where God is going to come and exercise that dominion over many different realms. And when you say dominion, we're talking obviously Seven Mountains mandate type thing. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So all that biz. So, and of course, Jesus always chooses the lowly, the small, and the unassuming. So, of course, he's
Yeah, because
going
he was
to.
born in a manger.
Right?
He was
He
born
was
in a
born in a
manger.
manger and grew up in Sale.
And you know what? There's this kind of urban legend when Dad first came to Sale, just before he moved here in the bank, he saw the Cobb and Co stables building and thought, oh, that'd make a good church because Jesus came in a stable. And a few years ago, the church actually ended up procuring that building. And it's a very interesting thing, because over the years there was talk of putting together a self-managed super fund to buy the building. I suspect that might be what's happened, but I have no proof of that, so I can't make any allegations there. But it's the building is actually owned by 24 church members, that is set up as like a company that the church then it's all interesting. It's all interesting.
Like a fulfillment of prophecy, I guess. Claire, was your father's church initially or even now aligned? I know you've said that it's aligned with a Malaysian group, but was it aligned with any sort of denomination here in Australia?
Yes, it was. Do you want to know the tea here? City Point, City Point Christian Centre that hit the news a while ago for the super homophobic, super transphobic statement of faith around the schools. They were Christian Outreach Centre, and Christian Outreach Centre is now called something else. But originally, City Builders Church was Christian Outreach Centre Sale, and it then under Dad's leadership went independent, became Sale City Church, and then after that changed to City Builders.
And do you know why he went independent? What was the driving reason?
My recollection there is that Dad felt that the denomination was trying to take the youth, trying to exert too much control over the youth in having the training programs that they had. And Dad didn't want to send us out for training. He wanted to train them himself. So that was one thing. I think they also sort of felt that they were pulling in a different direction when he became tied up with Jonathan David. So there was just, and the other thing is Dad hit burnout, and other churches, I think responsibly, when a pastor hits burnout, the best thing to do is to remove them from leadership, indefinitely, to make sure that they are adequately rehabilitated and cared for during burnout, because it is a serious physical and psychological condition. But when Dad hit burnout, the leadership of Sale City Church, Christian Outreach Centre Sale, whatever it was called at the time, really kind of banded around to hide that burnout from the denomination. And then he continued on in ministry.
I'm often a bit more cynical about that, and because I think that they don't, quite often churches don't see the markers along the way of burnout, and I think sometimes they might be removed from leadership because you don't want to damage the brand. You want to make sure that people stay on brand and on point. So quite often it is too late before they're pulled someone out, because if their psychological damage is so great that they've got to that point of burnout, I'm not saying you can't turn around from that, of course you can, but I just wonder, they just try and milk people right to the end and think, oh, we'll just keep praying for them. We'll pray for them. And because, of course, that's going to keep them psychologically safe.
It is rubbish. And the thing is, there's a duty of care that denominations should have towards their ministers. I mean, there's a whole generation of burnt out pastors who are screwed over on superannuation and adequate pay. Can we not at least look after their psychological health? Like, I think it's, I think it's irresponsible and negligent, not just for those pastors, but for the congregations that they shepherd. I really noticed at that time a change in the narrative. Like, Dad in the beginning, he just wanted people to find Jesus. He just wanted people to be saved. But the evangelist in him was replaced sort of with this urge to become a prophet and to kind of aspire to that apostolic sort of a role. And I started to hear a lot more narrative about his loss over the years and the things he'd sacrificed, which creates a sort of narrative of indebtedness and servitude that people owe him. That's my perspective on it anyway.
So when he went independent, was there a shift in the church at that point? I guess I'm trying to sort of dig and I'm trying to just find out, was it a good thing that he went independent, or are you saying he was burnt out and he should have basically been taking time off?
The latter. He was burnt out. He hit burnout a couple of times. I think that the responsible thing should have been to hand over leadership of the church. But that said, the church was pretty far gone prior to that in terms of the Isaac network and the dominionist kind of narrative seeping in, this kind of talk of spiritual fathering. Later on in this episode, we'll talk about 60 Minutes, but one of the one of the victims, actually two of the victims, James and Patrick, my ex-husband, talk about having essentially been groomed away from their parents to call my parents their mum or dad, their spiritual mum or dad. And there's countless stories of people echoing that and having really fractured relationships with their own parents and families because of this discipleship culture in city builders where they really, mum and dad were spiritual mum and dad, and they had this kind of superior faith, or they had this superior marriage, or they were superior to these other kids' parents.
When you try and objectively look at this, and it is difficult, I want to acknowledge it's really difficult when you're in the middle of it or you've been affected the way you have by this. But when you try and objectively look at, do you think your parents were doing things out of good intent? Out of a place of going, we want to make the world a better place. We totally believe and we are sold out to this message of dominion over the world because it's such a bad place. It's going to harm people if we don't influence it for Jesus. And if we don't take it over for Jesus, people are going to get hurt, they're going to get burned, and ultimately they're going to go to hell. Or do you think it was a power thing, and people buy into that power thing we know all the time? But your situation, what do you think was the intent behind that?
I think all of us think we are good people. I think all of us are trying our best. And even though my parents and I are not in contact, and I have no intention of breaching that wall at any point, because I've got kids now and I want to keep them and I want to keep me psychologically safe. I think it was good intent. I think there was this, it's interesting you interviewed Keith Green, well, the person from Last Days Ministries, that whole late 70s, early 80s charismatic renewal. There was this energy of Christ is coming back soon. We've got to save people. There was a sort of legalism in that approach to, you must save souls. It had to be benevolent. It had to be well-intentioned. But the more power you give a person and the more their own damage intersects with their life and the way that they pastor a group, I think the more risk factors you have for a group becoming truly toxic. I can't honestly sit and say my dad meant to become this monster in so many people's stories of PTSD, psychological damage, or I can't honestly say that. I hope that that's not the case, but it's hard for me to look at him as anything but a villain. So objectively, I don't think objectivity is really all that.
Look, as I said, objectivity is difficult in those sort of situations. But I guess I just want to draw that out because I think sometimes sometimes it is difficult to find the good in these sort of situations and identify whether people what their true motives are. And I know we've got sociopaths within churches. It's very, very common, and certainly the odds are skewed way against what it should be. I mean, we've got more sociopaths per capita than many places, I'm sure, in churches. But I guess I just wanted to pull that out from your perspective, but also to get you to step back a bit from it. So let's dive in a little bit around being a teenage fundamentalist within that environment. What's this doing for you? Who are you becoming in this? What are some of your core beliefs? What you've said before that you went to Malaysia and went to, was it Dr.
Jonathan David.
Jonathan David, and is that the Isaac Network? Is that
Yes.
what it was? Yes. So you went over there. That was in your early 20s, but building up to that, who are you becoming? What are you doing? What are some of your Clare McIvor / Kit Kennedyisms then?
Yeah, okay. This is really interesting because my parents recall early on when they were still living up in Wodonga, the pastor of the church, and I was little here, I'm talking a toddler or a baby even, the pastor of the church said to them, "Oh, this one's a sensitive one. You'll have to be careful how you raise this one." I wonder whether some of the situations I faced were dad kind of trying, or mum and dad trying to make me not sensitive, trying to toughen me up. But I was an artistic, sensitive sort of, I think naturally possibly an ambivert, but there was this from age 11, I was playing piano and I was on stage doing the music thing. From age 11, I was also sharing a room with a 21-year-old youth leader who was later on diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder, and thus began the trauma stages of my life, because some of the things that she did in her dissociated states were terrifying. And that became something that really scarred me quite deeply. So she left our family home, I think around the time I was 16. There was some significant kind of psychological damage at that point. I'd also had an accident at gymnastics where I dislocated my elbow, and my shoulder had also dislocated but not being picked up. Because we pray for these things, we don't necessarily pursue aggressive medical intervention. I was in pain my whole teenage life, but I was also the pastor's daughter, and I was expected to be a leader among my peers. I was also expected to kind of take on a pseudo parental role and really help with the homeschooling and the household chores and all that kind of stuff for my 4 younger siblings. I really limped into adulthood worn out. I was worn out. But I was also known as being this kind of sparkly personality, red lipstick, high heels, talented musician, knew how to draw a crowd. But I reflect on that as sort of a cult pseudo personality a little bit, because when you're discipled into a certain way of being, who are you? Do you have the opportunity to go, no, I'm an introvert. I don't want to be on stage. I don't want to be this. For me, I learned that the safest place to hide was in plain sight. So I kind of became this extroverted type. And by the time I was sort of 15, 16, well socialized into purity culture, there was this courtship narrative that you would court when you were of age. You would submit your desires or your ideas about who you'd marry to dad, and he'd pray about it and all that kind of stuff, decide whether it was worth pursuing or not. A number of my friends actually left the church or were kind of removed from leadership, and it was made very difficult for them to stay. Kind of a soft shunning, I suppose, because they'd chosen to date. At one point, we got wind that 2 youth group members were sleeping together. So, people were like sent to kind of stalk them, and found them down the back of Sale at the Common in a car. And like, it's horrendous kind of stuff. When you say it out loud, you're like, it was so normal to me, but it's not normal. By the time I was 18, 19, it's time to start thinking about career. As a homeschooled kid who hadn't set foot in a classroom since grade prep, Dad wanted me to become a teacher. I purposefully flubbed the admission paperwork, and then I ended up studying business, but the only place to do that was at RMIT in the city. So I then moved to another network church, and 60 Minutes called it a creepy encounter, where the pastor of that church was massaging me in his basement with my top off to help with this shoulder injury. It wasn't one creepy encounter, though. It was nearly 2 years of twice a week being in that basement, being subjected to counseling against my will. So it would become this really distressing time of, because Dad had told me not to do this discipleship course at that church. This pastor was telling me that I was broken beyond repair and I needed to do this discipleship course at this church. As I said on 60 Minutes, he'd kind of say things like, you're so broken beyond repair, your family doesn't love you only for what your talents and stuff like that. And it was really a psychological undoing. Like, he was really pulling at the threads of my psychological well-being. I think probably because he really thought I wanted that I'd be good for this course, or this course would be good for me. But as we know, when you're doing a mental health check on someone, you ask them whether they're safe. You ask them whether you're very careful in the way that you approach this conversation, so it's not suggestive that they should take their life. But the way he had these conversations with me was very suggestive, and he'd actually talk about methods of suicide that were more successful than others. And I'll never forget the calling Dad in a state of distress and being told not to come home until that was fixed. My plan had been to never go back to Sale, to kind of fall in love and escape to Melbourne and never go back. But I I came down with a pretty hardcore case of PTSD after that, and returned to Sale in my early 20s, a broken woman.
So, Kit, can I just clarify there? You rang your father, you told him what was going on, and he told you, don't come home
Don't come
until
home.
this is
Yeah.
solved. So, what did he mean by that?
By this stage, there was a rift happening between the two churches. They were a bit competitive. Now, my recollection is that I told him of my distress and that I told him what was going on, but he says that never happened. I am sure it happened, and I'm sure it happened out the front of this mini golf place that was on the way home from the train station at uni, and I was sitting in my yellow Gemini with which is horrific in itself, the brown corduroy, but like, he swears it never happened. Is that true? Or is it gaslighting? I don't know. But he knew I was being massaged in the basement. He knew that there was serious arguments happening, and he knew that I was distressed.
That's messed up shit. And we're not talking, it happened once or twice, as you said. Like this is 2 years. This is going on. This is
Yes.
And in fairness, even if it had happened once or twice, right, it's still messed up shit.
Absolutely it is. Once or twice it could be opportunistic. 2 years, it's premeditated. It's very well planned. I mean, that's some creepy shit.
This is how I think it went down. He kind of left me in there as sort of, I felt like I was the ambassador from City Builders to this other church, which I won't name. But eventually he didn't pull me out until Jonathan David had given the clearance to remove me. And by that stage, Dad was like, you need to write this pastor a card and say there's no hard feelings, and you need to have a meeting with this other member of his church to mediate, to try to like leave with no hard feelings and no offense, because offense is the worst. It's terribly sinful to be offended, not terribly sinful to be offensive. But yeah, so I remember this absolute disaster of a mediation meeting. It was out in Mornington. This pastor turned up, screamed, like just yelled, and just got very wound up, and I didn't get a word in, and then he kind of left, and that was it. But I sort of knew straight away that Dad was having, like, when I wrote down that card, no hard feelings, like, Dad wanted me to forgive and move on, i.e. never seek justice for what had happened there or previously with this other person who shared a room with me. So yeah, it was messed up, but coming back to Sale was out of the frying pan and back into another frying pan.
So it's interesting to note that even though your father was, in air quotes, independent in terms of his church, he was still answering to this person, Jonathan David, over in Malaysia, and he couldn't just pull his daughter out of a situation. So there was still a hierarchy that he was being pulled into line by.
Yes, I call City Builders. I believe City Builders is a cult. I believe that the Isaac Network is a cult, but it's kind of like a babushka doll situation of cults. Like, they're independent, but they're in this, network of churches. But like, if you were to Google City Builders and look at the coverage on the Age newspaper or 60 Minutes, they actually show emails in which, as late as 2015, Dad was taking orders from Jonathan David and passing them directly on to the leadership. Like, it's shown in evidence, and I have no doubt that continues today. When they launched the Stables building, I think it was just after the COVID lockdowns lifted, Jonathan David was actually there, and these other network churches were there from the Isaac Network. That's how they filled the building, because it's only a very small group of people. But, these groups are quite good at polishing and putting on a show to make it look all shiny and look all, well attended and look more powerful than it is.
Absolutely. You can roll a turd in glitter. Looks shiny, looks beautiful, but it's still a turd at the end of the day. I mean, that's the reality.
I'm so going to quote that and put that on my Insta.
we may use it for our promo too.
Has this ever happened to you? I went to Sunday school every Sunday, and now I can't hear a loud horn without having an anxiety attack.
Hi, I'm recently deceased but never forgotten Christian music sex symbol Carmen. I'm calling collect from the big house, meaning heaven, not jail, to tell yous how to get answers for your religious traumas.
I started the excommunication station, and now I realize why empathy felt weird when I was a kid, and how the Council for National Policy, a shadowy Christian organization, controls just about fucking everything in America.
So if you've been looking for answers, or if you have ever been on the outside wondering, hey, what's really going on in the church, these gabagools have the info you need. So look up the excommunication station wherever you get your podcasts, and all their socials under XCOMPod. Peace be with yous.
Hey Troy, I would like to give a huge shout out to our Patreon supporters.
So you should, Brian, because we do love our Patreon subscribers.
Our Patreon subscribers get a range of benefits, including free merch, access to our exclusive subscribers group, and a monthly live video call with us. All proceeds go towards the running and promotion cost of the podcast.
Find out more at patreon.com/IWATF or see our Linktree URL in the show notes.
Hashtag fucking blessed. I mean, look, we could dig into the Dominion theory stuff and go forever, but we want to make sure we get to your story and some of the stuff that goes from here. So how old are you at this point where you've returned to Sale?
I'm 22 years old. I'm 22. Okay, so my ex-husband, his two sisters. Like Patrick's my ex-husband. Let's just call him Patrick from here on in. I lived with his two sisters, Rebecca and Kathleen. I ended up a partner in a cafe, which was 7 years of trying not to go bankrupt. It was horrendous, but it was kingdom business. We want to cross over to take over. We want to have these kingdom businesses. So it's funny. I'm sitting in a car, and the cafe is now a nail salon. So it's weird seeing it. But I was running a cafe. I was working kind of in a role that was kind of an annex to the Department of Education, Students at Risk. I was on the music team, I was on the leadership team, I was on the youth team, I was on all of the teams. And look, I'll just say, like there was a number of kind of courtship possibilities for me over the years, but I really wanted to be treated as an equal, and I wasn't seeing that opportunity in this heavily complementarian, male headship, male leadership, female submission kind of situation that I was immersed in. I was exhausted just by the weight of carrying around this trauma and chronic pain with the shoulder. This is two cringeworthy things. One is that I wrote a couple of novels that I definitely think were cult propaganda. But another is that I did actually have a couple of spontaneous remissions, i.e. God healed my shoulder, i.e. God healed my, a couple of other conditions. As somebody now an agnostic with atheistic kind of fantasies, I find it difficult to interpret that, but on a kind of neuropsychological level, I do understand how spontaneous remissions happen, but I don't know what to call that. But honestly, there were so many regular PTSD triggers, and at this point my PTSD intersected with suicidal ideation. So I was living a really just unstable, just really stressful and distressing existence, but masking it all as looking really just fantastic. When I was 27, Dad approached Patrick and said, oh, you and Claire are getting along really well. And Patrick was like, yeah, we've become really good friends. And Dad then said to him, oh, but you wouldn't marry her, would you? And Patrick said, no, I really admire all your daughters, but I can't see myself marrying any of them. But then eventually push came to shove, and Patrick and I had a real affinity for each other. We were really good friends. I saw him as somebody who would treat me as an equal. And he was in this gay conversion practices kind of ecosystem. And it's important to call them practices because it's not just gay conversion therapy. And it shits me to tears when people call it and say, oh, I'm opposed to gay conversion therapy. Oh, really? So you're opposed to a therapeutic approach that is debunked by science, that the UN calls torture, that is so damaging and ineffective, but you're not actually saying that you're opposed to the weaponization of prayer, prophecy, and proselytizing against LGBTQIA people to a point where they develop this crippling internalized homophobia and think that God has predestined them for hell, you're okay with that. That's conversion practices.
So this was happening inside the church, though. This wasn't an external parachurch thing, but it was part of your dad's church.
Okay, so what happened? There was a practitioner of gay conversion therapy proper, within an hour of us, and he was an ex-gay man married to a woman, but he was an older guy. So he actually, the way it's been relayed to me is that Patrick was instructed to find someone to help him with his sexuality, and he found this person, and numerous people from City Builders have kind of connected with this person over the years. I know of a few, but I have no doubt that there's more. The therapy aspect of it was external, but the ecosystem of conversion practices was very much embedded in our experience of church, and I would say is embedded in a lot of churches. If you're preaching and if you've got these pastoral care sessions and if you're casting demons of homosexuality or transgenderism out of people, you are undertaking conversion practices. And obviously I'm straight and this has never happened to me, but I've heard enough stories and I've seen enough instances to know that it did happen at City Builders, and it definitely happened to Patrick.
Did your father know that Patrick was gay?
Yes.
Was undergoing this therapy? Well, I don't like to call it therapy either because it's not a therapy. And then tried to pair you off with Patrick?
My impression of it that I've gotten from Patrick and that I believe 100% is that Dad started counselling him against being gay when he was a teenager. So by the time Patrick was, I think he was 23 when we started courting, he believed he was cured, but I could tell because of the emotional attachment he had to those words that there was still something there. But I naively, thank you purity culture, believed that if he was attracted to me, that was enough. And lol. So the first year of our courtship was a disaster. I think I've cried in every restaurant in Gippsland because he was trying to hide his sexual orientation from himself and from me, and I was trying to hide PTSD from him. So there was this struggle within both of us that just really exploded against each other. Eventually, Dad made the call to break off our relationship or to pause it. And then I went through that point I was formally diagnosed with PTSD, and Patrick began formal conversion practices. About a year later, we got back together after having sat down with Jonathan David over in Malaysia, which was partially to talk about what had happened with me in that basement with that pastor, and partially, I think, for him to case Patrick out. And 2.5 weeks later, we were engaged.
I want to just stop you there and say, your father set you up. Your father put a pause on it. Some man in Malaysia is investigating your situation and your relationship and eventually giving the blessing. Even from a mainstream evangelical perspective, this is not normal.
I like to call, I think the official term is shitfuckery. It's just really, it's not normal. And now, as a single woman who's about to turn 40, flirty and thriving, just navigating dating as a normal is so difficult because this was what I grew up with. That bubbly persona that I put on to kind of survive my situation was obviously interpreted by a lot of people as flirtatious. And can I say, not so much for you two gentlemen, but for the women who are listening, it is difficult to dance with abandon for the Lord, as you're expected to in evangelical churches, but not let the boys know that you got titties or an ass. And it's especially difficult when your cleavage starts at your clavicle. So, I was forever in trouble for flirting or for being too curvy or, various different things. And now I'm kind of matched up with a cured gay. And I hate saying that because having supported him through his deconstruction and accepting his sexuality And now he actually lives like 300 meters from me. He's my best friend, and I'm so proud of him for navigating difficult territory. Like, he wasn't cured back then. Because you can't cure something that's not a problem, that's not wrong, that is. People in evangelical circles often think that being gay is a choice. No, it's not. If you're gay, it's not about who you're having sex with or who you're not having sex with. It's not even just about who you are attracted to. It's in everything. It's in how you dress. It's in how you walk. It's in how you present to the world. And having to repress all of that is freaking exhausting. And it's not even something that should be repressed. People should be who they are. They should like what they like. It's just abhorrent the way that people talk about this.
You skipped over the fact that there was a great fashion and styling sense as a great spin-off from this as well. So
Oh,
let's not
God.
forget that. But we're
Oh,
talking. You sort of skipped over a lot and went straight to, hey, and Patrick's a great guy and we're good friends. But what happened? I mean, you got married, you had kids.
yes.
And so there's a lot in between there. What's happened in that period? And what's happening for you? I mean, there's lots we could ask. I mean, you've been diagnosed with PTSD in a church that I'm sure doesn't believe in PTSD because you should just pray it away. So there's something in that. But where are you going? You're married. There's a few years here, I'm sure.
Yeah. And they were great years. I will say they were great years. So first of all, on the PTSD thing, it is subclinical now. I will never say that I'm cured, because the moment I say I'm cured, I will have a meltdown and then feel, I'll have an episode and I'll feel ashamed for having an episode. I will never say I'm cured of PTSD. I will say it's subclinical and that I'm doing a badass job of managing it. I'll also say that it's a lot easier to manage now that I'm not in SAIL. So Patrick and I married. The honeymoon was a holy shit moment for him, I think. But what people don't realize is when you've gone through, when you're deeply repressed, doesn't mean that the plumbing doesn't work. It just means it's complicated. When we married, people were like, oh, they're so right for each other. And we were just meant to be kind of best friends, I think, but not necessarily meant to be married. Patrick threw himself into politics. He became the deputy mayor. He was running the AEDC and the FEDC, I believe, for the National Party down here.
Sorry, what are the acronyms?
I don't know, but it's the the FEDC is the Federal Area Council, and the AEDC is the Assembly something. It's the state government area. So,
and this is conservative political party, by the way.
Yes, it is. It's the Nationals are agrarian socialists, if you're trying to like name them, but they are conservative. They're farmers. It's an easy party to stack because they are, a lot of the members or a lot of the active members are older, so they see young blood and they're like, great, this is fantastic. So Patrick got involved, and then Dad's encouragement was to get other people involved as well, and soon we're like a couple of years in to our marriage, and I'm exhausted. I'm running a business. I'm on the music team. I'm working another job. I'm writing fiction as escapism. I'm discipling people. I'm, so exhausted. Patrick's in council and doing all this other politics stuff. And Darren Chester, the MP, this federal MP, locks up the pre-selection unopposed, and then comes out and says that he is pro-marriage equality. The grassroots members of the National Party were unimpressed with this. The grassroots, the policy with the Nationals is that it's a grassroots movement, and policies are supposed to come from the membership, and that the MPs then represent them. This didn't happen with Darren, so Patrick was encouraged to write a letter to the editor stating the displeasure of the members about that. But of course, because Dad, there actually became this effort behind the scenes to remove Darren Chester from office, to have him disendorsed by the party. And so my closeted gay husband was put at the front of that. And this time was a real stomach-churning, awful moment, because obviously he knew deep down he was gay. I suspected that he was still in some way same-sex attracted. And to be frank, I love like so many of my friends are queer, and yet I became the wife of this incredible homophobe who was trying to, disendorse Darren Chester. But behind the scenes, there were meetings happening in my dad's lounge room where there was a coordinated effort to get letters to the editor, like in constantly. They were being authored by a member of City Builders leadership, and then different people were signing off on them. A number of people did write their own letters, but a lot of them were authored by this single pen. There was no genuine backlash against Darren. He's a great MP. He's a wonderful guy, but it was being made to look like there was this huge backlash. A number of church members and people affiliated with Dad's church became members of the National Party. This is branch stacking. They became members of the National Party for the purpose of this campaign, or during the course of this campaign. We do not believe them to be genuine members, and this effort to get Darren disendorsed happened. At this time, I found it difficult to even leave the house. It was horrendous, and eventually what happened was the campaign failed. Darren remained in office, but I regret to say I think maybe it has made some of his ambitions within the party perhaps a little. Sometimes I look at Barnaby Joyce and I think, how the fuck are you still in office? And I think maybe that's our fault, like in terms of party leadership. Barnaby Joyce is a lunatic, but he's like bad Bob the Tomato. But anyway, basically the timeline from there goes to Patrick and I trying to start a family. And I had 4 miscarriages over the course of a year. And that's a lot. And it was like compounded grief every time. And I would just cry in the shower. I would just sob in the shower and kind of like just scream at God, like, after all I've been through, how can you put me through this too? But honestly, I think on a nervous system level, it was like my body knew I couldn't sustain a pregnancy. I couldn't bring a child into this reality. And on the 11th of November 2015, having asked me that Sunday if Patrick was all right, and having said no, Dad paid a pastoral care visit to Patrick. At this time, I'd been going through counselling with a Christian couple, and I was doing well, but Dad had been kind of encouraging us to go, do these other courses, or, go over to deliverance ministries, go through fire tunnels, all that kind of bullshit. On the 11th of November, Dad paid this visit to Patrick, and I watched Dad walk into the house and thought, that's not a pastoral care posture. Shoulders were up, rounded forward. He looked like he was about to swing punches. I went out for lunch with my friends, and when I came back, Dad was leaving, and he was in a huff. And I went inside. Patrick looked like he'd absolutely seen a ghost. And what had happened was, 3 weeks prior, we'd watched Going Clear, the Scientology documentary, and that was a holy shit moment for Patrick. And he'd said to me some weeks after it, are we in an abusive church? And I said, yeah. And that was obvious. I just said, yeah. When Dad came around, Patrick kind of held up the mirror for him and kind of challenged him on a few things, and that was absolutely unacceptable. And thus began the process of us being managed out the door. I say excommunicated. Nick Mackenzie, the journalist who did the 60 Minutes piece, eventually, he didn't say that because he doesn't say anything that can't be proven. But the modus operandi had been like, you'd ask Dad for his advice and then he'd send you away, and then he'd say, you tell me what you're going to do. But then you'd toe the line. You'd do exactly what he wanted to do. So the paper trail all pointed to us having excommunicated ourselves. But in actual fact, for 4 months it was the same day I found out I was pregnant with Henry, our son. For 4 months, I'd really campaigned to stay because I wanted to fix it from the inside. Who wants to have to admit to themselves that their father's legacy, and that they'd put so much blood, sweat and tears and, sacrifice so much to support and armor bear and be part of for so many years, who wants to admit that that has been detrimental to not only my own life, but my husband's life and the lives of so many other people? And I knew that as soon as news broke that we were out, I was going to become a lightning rod of sorts for other people's stories. And that happened. We tried to keep it quiet that we'd left. We went to another church in Sale, and that was restorative for a time. But 3 years after we left, it was the 1-year anniversary of the plebiscite, which was a horrendous time. At the time of the plebiscite, I was 7 months pregnant with our younger daughter, and
Just for the sake of our international listeners, the plebiscite being the same-sex referendum in Australia to allow same-sex marriage.
What happened in Sale was, because there's so many aggressively conservative people who'd really been taught how to engage in a particular way and make it look like there was more backlash than there was. Well, that's how I interpret it anyway. There was such aggressive bullying going on social media, and it was flying every which way. And I was getting phone calls from people going, why can't you just support us in this? There was an unmarked ad that went into the newspaper and at the time there were several City Builders members working at the newspaper. There was just so much bullying going on, and I was just copying so much flack because people either didn't know I'd left City Builders. One of the City Builders leaders was actually in the No Campaign ad, which was horrendous. My husband was crying into what was left of my lap, going, maybe I'm gay. And I was dealing with that while dealing with all of this, while trying to get through a high-risk pregnancy and having no family support. And thank God for this other church that we were going to, that they stepped in and offered a lot of support. And my pseudo-mama, who I'm staying with at the moment, she stepped in and gave some support. But look, it was horrendous. And then on the year anniversary of that, there was another blow up on social media. We didn't know about it because we'd unfriended everyone, but we started getting phone calls. So eventually news broke that we were no longer at City Builders. It broke on social media. It went viral. People's stories just started blowing up our inboxes. The newspaper ran a story that it was supposed to be an attack piece, so I've heard, but on City Builders, but it actually ended up reading more like City Builders propaganda. And at that point, it became really difficult for me to leave the house. Either I was dodging cult members, I do call it a cult. Patrick had been threatened with defamation if he didn't stop me from blogging a couple of times. There'd been a couple of other sort of threats happen. They tried to involve our pastor of the church that we're going to in that. It's dizzying just how shitty that time was. Fast forward to January 2020, Patrick had gotten a job down in Melbourne, and he said to me on the 20th of January, I'm doing really well, or we're doing really well. And I was like, yes, I know. He's like, I'm still calling helplines a lot. And I was like, yes, I know. He'd embraced bisexuality as his thing at that time, but I think that was really to be kind to me, to give me hope. But on the 20th of January, he said we need to transition this relationship to a friendship. And I was angry and upset, and I cried a lot for about 2.5 weeks. And then I realised that I'd felt quite platonic to him for a long time. But as a good Christian submitted wife, I was going to make that marriage work. And at the point at which I accepted that I could no longer fight for my marriage, I started fighting for the family life I wanted. And I wanted his friendship, and I wanted our kids to have parents that liked each other, not just for them. And I wanted to have his support, but also I wanted him to move me out of Sale. And so he did that in July of 2020. We moved to Melbourne, to a suburb I won't name. He lived with us in the family home for 6 months to settle the kids in. We made some beautiful friends during COVID. Finally got to not fear leaving the house. Finally got to not fear having to bear the burden of other people's stories. But that burden never really went away, because the whole time I was being, like, there was just interest from media, radio station here or an article there, and I'd said no to all of them because on a piece of paper in my jewellery box, I'd made a promise to myself that I wouldn't talk to media unless it was to stop City Builders from victimising other people, to stop them from gaining more power. It couldn't just be about a family grudge. It had to be a decent investigative journalist with a good reputation, and it had to be at a time where I was emotionally, psychologically safe. In January of 2022, I was already aware of some alleged branch stacking within the Liberal Party, because we kind of burned them pretty bad with the Nats.
Kit, let me just say again for our International listeners, ironically, the Conservative Party in Australia is called the Liberal Party. Right, so which is comedy in itself, comedy gold, I know. But we are talking about the right wing Conservative Party in Australia, who are aligned with the Nationals. They have a coalition.
I was aware of some allegations of branch stacking. I was aware that within the Liberal Party, they knew that there was another Heath sister. Heath's my maiden name. They hadn't connected the dots, but in January of 2022, a member of the media connected the dots, a magazine writer, and approached me about doing a gay conversion therapy story and telling our ever so inspiring story of the friendship and the beautiful partnership we have of surviving all of this. And I was like, no, you can't have a straight woman tell a story of surviving gay conversion therapy. That's Patrick's story. It is not my story. My story has got so many more layers, as you've heard today. It's a lot, it's fucked in and of its own sort of right. So I said no to that, and I just continued saying no to all the offers that came back because I had no interest in being a Liberal Party chew toy. And then I get this very excited call going, would you talk to Nick McKenzie? And I was like, who the hell's Nick McKenzie? It turns out he's the best in the business in Australia when it comes to investigative journalism. He's won, I think, 14 Walkleys. I think he's been the Journalist of the Year in 2 different categories, twice each. He's exposed casino corruption, war crimes, Calabrian mafia. Like, the guy is ballsy. So fast forward to me sitting in a cafe with this journalist going, why the heck are you interested in my story? Because I think I'd convinced myself that my story wasn't that bad. It's denial. It is that bad. I'd coped with humor, with rationalization, with kind of doing these deep dives into theology and church culture and across the world, trying to kind of normalize my experience, but my experience was not normal. So he's, I think, fearsome in media circles. He's definitely got a fair bit of media BDE, but you meet him and he's kind of like a Labrador puppy. Like, he's just kind and just supportive and just wants to hear the story and kind of seems genuinely interested in you as a person. But it took him a few months to convince me that my story was safe in his hands, and a condition of that was that it centered other victims and that I wasn't the main story, because by this stage my sister had rolled a sitting member of parliament for the safest seat in Victoria. The Liberal Party was now facing serious issues in terms of losing relevance to the main voters, in terms of lurching further to the far right. And the factional wars were kind of taking on a bit of a life of their own within the party, and there was a state election coming up. So I ended up a whistleblower, but I didn't do it because I wanted to air family laundry. I really didn't. I did it because I knew so many victims of city builders were still living in fear and dread. So many of them dealing with these scars of their time on the inside and not being able to talk about it because they'd, allegedly been threatened. Like, I did it for them, and I did it because during the pandemic, Patrick was part of an incredible group of victim survivors of gay conversion practices, who helped get conversion practices banned in the state of Victoria. I'm so relentlessly proud of them for that, because they re-traumatized themselves. They put themselves in this place of severe emotional kind of fraughtness so that other people wouldn't go through the abhorrent processes and practices that they'd gone through. He helped get that across the line. We played a little bit of a drinking game when Danny O'Brien from the National Party gave his speech about why he wasn't opposing their gay conversion therapy ban. He mentioned Patrick's name and my name a couple of times, so we kind of were like, yeah, shot. Well, at least I was. Patrick was somewhere else. But yeah, knowing the agenda that had been behind the political efforts within City Builders, I knew that this was just going to be dangerous for them to get into power unchecked. And it is my belief that years of indoctrination towards armor bearing and towards, you learn by obedience or you learn by pain and, crossing over to take over, I kind of felt like I knew what this was all about, and I felt a responsibility to speak up.
So just to draw that out a bit, your sister is put into this very safe seat, looking at securing the seat through state parliament through the election. Now, this is, I'm assuming, to do with the Dominion theology. Let's have some influence in this political sphere of power in Victoria.
Mm.
Is that correct?
My feeling is that it has to be correct, but I'm really hesitant because I've been threatened with defamation so many times by various different means, including in the lead up to publishing. A connection of the churches set up fake email accounts to threaten Nick and I, try to coerce me into silence and try to warn Nine Entertainment off publishing the story that was covered in The Age. Renee, well, my sister, who I love, I really do love her. I haven't had a quality conversation with her for years. She likely claims that it is wholly on her, that it was her desire. But the Renee I knew prior to wasn't interested in politics and only became interested kind of after the Darren Chester thing. So I can't really tell you what's going on in her head because I will not get involved in the thought error of thinking you can mind read. That's something that you learn in prophetic circles is, I know what God told me that this is your motivation, or, it's mind reading. It's actually just, it's a fallacy.
So what we'll do, Kit, is we will make sure that we put the links to the 60-minute stories, the links to the Age stories, etc. Everything that's on the public record, so that people can go and do a bit of a deeper dig into that. I guess my question to you now, though, is you've done all this. This has all happened.
Mm-hmm.
Where are you now? And where's your relationship with the church, with your family, with your once upon a time religion?
I have no contact with my family. During our, when we were kind of managed out the door, our relationships with our family evaporated overnight. And it was a kind of a hard estrangement in the beginning. It was like nothing, or, no nice contact, only nasty contact. And that was, for a while, we kind of towed the line and tried to attend parties and pretend everything was okay when it just definitely wasn't. But I've kind of realized that the more I kind of play in that space, the more at risk I am of my children being groomed away from me, which concerns me deeply, because the fact is they don't see themselves as a cult. They see themselves as people who are sent by God to save the world from the era of social progressiveness and the era of godlessness and all that sort of stuff. What would be more important to them? My relationship with my children, Patrick's relationship with his children, or their entitlement to these kids that, that I want to keep my children safe from that. So no, I don't allow contact with my family. And I hope at some point in the future there can be some contact with my siblings. But I think it would require probably a professional mediator in the beginning, because I simply cannot engage with people who will try to deny the abuse and the wrongdoing that I've lived through or that I've spoken up about, because this ruins people's lives, and I won't engage with it. I won't engage with the gaslighting. I won't engage with the love bombing. I won't engage with anything that's not authentic from them. So nothing there. Like I said before, in terms of faith, I'm agnostic with atheistic fantasies. I think I've seen too much to potentially to really rule out the existence of a higher power. But I definitely don't think of God as an old white man in the sky who will punish you if you own dildos or don't fast forward the sex scenes in movies. I definitely don't think that God is this supreme being who has a set of choose your own adventure, right choice, wrong choice consequences for your life. But I don't know what the divine is, and I'm open to exploring. But it's hard. I don't think I'll ever set foot in a church again. I love running Unchurchable, the podcast, because I still do love theology. I still do love thinking about spirituality and the divine and the human condition. I love that. I'm so nerdy for it. I've been studying psychology while also working as a research writer. And the human condition is so fascinating, and the existence of spirituality as a theme that intersects with humanity in various different ways over the years, I love. But no, I'm not a woman of faith necessarily. But whether or not Jesus is God doesn't bother me. He was probably just a dude in my mind. But his teachings were great. Love and inclusion. And when they're not polluted by centuries of patriarchy and translated and retranslated to bed down a system that suppresses women and minorities, Jesus is okay with me.
So you do love theology. So I was just wondering if you had a scripture to back up that God doesn't send dildo-owning people to hell.
Jesus wept. No, no. But I think it's interesting. I mean, I think progressive theology is great and terrible at the same time, because really progressive theology is trying to peel the onion in a way that it makes a different group of people cry. And truly, I think it's better to just sit back and go, well, the Bible is what it is, but is it the truth? Probably not. I don't get behind biblical inerrancy.
I remember when I first started listening to your podcast, Unchurchable.
Oh, you listen? Oh my God.
I did. And in the early days, you were still trying to hold on to some sort of Christianity.
Yeah.
And I remember that, and I remember listening and thinking, oh, okay, so she's at that stage, you know what I mean? And then talking to you now, you've definitely progressed. You've definitely grown. And I don't say that in a patronizing way, Kit. I really don't. I'm celebrating that. I just think your story, my reflection on this is your story is so difficult because A, you were born into it, but the aggressors are your own family. Brian and I tell our stories. We could go back to our families, in spite of everything that was happening in the church. And again, I don't want to sound trite, but my heart just goes out because if it hadn't been for your husband, who you now, when your ex-husband, who you now call your best friend, this would have been even far more isolating for you.
I hate to say it, but I just simply would not have survived. I simply would not have survived. That's the fact. Even when we were preparing for the story with Nick, there was one particular day where Patrick and I needed to sit down together and do some prep work, and about 3 hours in, I just burst into tears. I just started sobbing, and I said to him I would not have survived another year. So he did. He saved my life, and perhaps in a certain way I saved his. And gosh, this is macabre. It's so macabre, but here on the other side of it, there are some days when I miss my family so much, but then I realize that compared to the reality of what I lived, I miss the idea of them. I miss what they should have been, but I don't miss what actually happened to me. But I've built this beautiful tribe of chosen family. It's ironic being here and being with my pseudo mama, and she's like a grandma to the kids. I'm so lucky. And I think for people who fear, even for pastors' kids in toxic churches, yeah, the sense of loss is immense, and you'll never forget the visceral wound of having lost family that way, or having had to face up to the fact that family is not safe for you, and that family has done so much damage to other people. But there's this beautiful hope in the life that I now live. I've got such great friends. I have got such a great relationship with my baby daddy. I get to be a really present and compassionate mother to my children that I wouldn't have been able to be when I was so strung out, anxious, depressed, just eaten up with trauma like I was back then. And I get to have a shot at finding love again. Dating apps awful, but one day I'll find love again. I get to sleep in on a Sunday or go and have a boozy brunch with friends, and I get to decide what my life is. And while it's been scary learning how to navigate all of that, it's so beautiful. And I get to teach my daughter, my strong spirited daughter, that she can grow up and be whatever the hell she wants. She doesn't have to submit to a man or make herself less for a man or like sacrifice her personality because it doesn't fit with this ideal of a no negative emotion or no strong thinking. And I'm so happy for her that she doesn't have to live the life I did. And I'm happy for me that I don't have to live the life I did.
Kid, I want to thank you for coming on the show. Your story is extremely powerful. I'm sitting here triggering and feeling overwhelmed. I'm just being honest, as someone that's sitting here listening to this story, dealing with my own religious baggage. But I know it's an amazing story to tell, and it's an important story to tell. And I can hear the pain in your voice as you tell us, So thank you. And please know this is not a trite, monologue at you. I'm so proud of you. I'm so thrilled that you are a success, that you have done all that you have done. And in the face of everything that you have gone through, you are who you are. I'm resonating with you. I'm standing with you. I support you. I know Brian does as well. And thank you so much for being you and turning this around to the point where not only did this happen to you, but you made a difference. You blew the whistle and you're continuing to sound the alarm. So kudos to you, Kit Kennedy. Kudos to you.
Thank you so much. And I've got 5% left on my computer sitting here in the car out the front of my old cafe. So if I drop out soon, sorry about that. But I just want to say, yes, you still hear pain in my voice. Perhaps that's because I am in SAIL, but perhaps also because after years of being conditioned against negative emotion, I actually embrace the pain because it is the price of love and it is part of life's experience. But also, people who are listening to this, Lifeline 131114, Q Life is another great resource. And I think over in America, the mental health helplines, I think it's 988. I'm always aware of the fact that there's so many different trigger points of trauma in my story that look after yourself after reading this. But also please know that with time, therapy, medication, and friends that really affirm who you are and who you were born to be in terms of your natural personality, orientation, all of that kind of stuff, life can be beautiful.
Thank you again. Thank you for sitting in your car for an hour and a half to talk to us and having to do that in the town that was the epicenter of your trauma. We want to celebrate you, celebrate who you are and who you're going to become. So thank you again and have an amazing day.
Yes, and it's so lovely to meet you both. Thank you so much.
If you'd like to connect with the I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist podcast, then please see the links in our link tree in the show notes. We invite you to pop across to our very vibrant listener community on Facebook, which is a private group, and we're also on Instagram, Twitter, and Reddit. Also, a huge thank you to Lucy, who manages our social strategy, and to Kerry and Bree, who manage our Facebook listener group. All of our episodes are transcribed to increase accessibility, and the I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and pretty much wherever you get your podcasts. It's produced and hosted by Brian McDowell and Troy Waller, with all sound production and editing done by Troy Waller. You can find all these links in our link tree in the show notes.